Good afternoon. Thank y'all for being here. I'm Margaret Poindexter. I'm the president and chairman of the Foundation for Shackleford Horses, and I have been in that role since the end of 2014. I also served in that capacity from 1998 to 2002. At my left is Carolyn Mason, who is the immediate past president of the foundation. She served in that role from 2002 till 2014. She was also one of the founding directors of the foundation. She's one of the small group of local folks who first came together and formed the foundation back in 1996. This is our birthday week, as we like to call it, because the foundation was formed in August the 9th of 1996. It's when the Secretary of State acknowledged the formation of the organization, the Foundation for Shackleford Horses, a North Carolina nonprofit organization. It is also the week that we celebrate the enactment of the Shackleford Banks Wild Horses Protection Act, which is the federal law that protects and preserves the wild horses on Shackleford Banks. That was enacted August the 13th, so we just celebrated that birthday, of 1998. So a little more than 2 years after the formation of this small local nonprofit, they succeeded in getting federal legislation passed to preserve and protect the horses. Pretty amazing. And it's a pretty amazing story, and I love to tell it because it is meaningful to me as somebody whose family is from here. I grew up visiting my grandparents. In the summer times, my granddaddy would put me on his little boat, take me over to Shackleford Banks, show me the horses. I begged and begged and begged for a horse from the time I was about this tall, and when I had my 10th birthday, he gave me a horse, and he was a wild horse. He had come from Cedar Island, not Shackleford, but same general family, and that was Tarzan, my beloved Tarzan. So it's very meaningful to me because of the subject matter, but it's also meaningful because I like to tell people it is a civics lesson for all of us. It is a lesson in civics and citizenship. And in these, shall we say, fraught political times when people perhaps believe that politics is either out of control or you've tuned it out because you just don't want to hear it anymore. Pay attention to this story because it will give you hope. It is an example of democracy at its best. And what I mean by that is it's the story of a small group of local folks in a local community who saw something that was happening with which they disagreed and that they believed would be harmful, and they came together and they prevailed upon the experts and they collected information and data and real facts to support their cause and their case. And they took it to government officials and they made that case and they shared that information with them. And in turn, those government officials took up their cause and pulled in other people of other political persuasions and across the aisle, and they joined together and they supported this cause and they passed federal legislation that protected and preserved these horses. And so today what we're going to do is sort of fill in some of the details about that story. But like I say, the story of the Shackleford Banks horses is truly a civics lesson for us all, and it shows what you can do if you believe in something and you go about it the right way. It doesn't have anything to do with politics. It has to do with having a passion for your cause and believing in it. So with that said, I will kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about, how they came to be and what got them involved. And I'm going to call on Carolyn a couple of times to fill in some of the first person details of the story because she was one of those people who was instrumental in making some of these things happen along the way. And Carmine Prilly, I'm going to put him on the spot here. He's written a book, and if you all haven't read his book, The Wild Horses of Shackleford Banks, I encourage you to read it because it's a great account of the history of all of this, not just what happened in terms of the history of the legislation, but the whole history of the horses on the banks and what we know about them. And that's what made this so compelling. If you ask people who are from here, how many of you are quote unquote from here? If you ask people who are from here, where'd the horses come from? The majority of them will say, they've always been there. They've always been there. And so if that's the case, then surely there are examples of that all throughout our history. Well, there are. There's documentation of the existence of those horses all throughout history. They are not just something that were left behind when people finally just moved off the banks. That's not how it came to be. They have, in fact, always been there. So that was part of the story that these folks told when they were urging that they needed to be saved. But let's backtrack a little bit and talk about how that came to be. As you may or may not know, at one time, Core Banks, Shackleford Banks was all owned by the state of North Carolina. North Carolina handed that property over to the feds for the creation of Cape Lookout National Seashore in 1968. Is that correct? Yeah, 61, thank you. There were, in addition to lots of horses on Shackleford Banks, there were goats and pigs and sheep and cattle. Those were removed as a condition of the transfer. The feds did not want livestock in a national seashore area. But the state cautioned them. They said, okay, we get it. Take them off, but don't mess with those horses because people will raise you know what if you do. So don't take them off. So the feds rocked along with that for a little while. Not entirely happy about that because horses are considered under the vernacular, and I guess I should have told y'all as a part of my introduction, I'm a lawyer, sorry. That's my background, and I was in fact a lawyer at one time for the Department of the Interior. And so I know their lingo, their nomenclature, whatever. And in the vernacular of the Park Service is the term exotic species. Horses were considered an exotic species, meaning they aren't native. They were brought here, introduced to the landscape by man. And so the park wasn't comfortable with them being out there. They didn't want them. They didn't fit in. They wanted to get rid of them. And they saw, once they removed the cows and the sheep and the goats, that the population of the horses exploded. Well, sure, they had no competition anymore for resources, right? They also tried to argue that the horses were degrading the natural resources on the island, that they were adversely impacting the natural vegetation. Not exactly. Because horses, if any of you have horses, you know horses are pretty picky about what to eat. A goat or a sheep will pretty much mow down anything. Horses are very particular. So, but they nonetheless tried to make the argument that vegetation was being adversely impacted. Well, with so many more horses than had been there previously, yeah, they were starting to forage some things that are out of their normal diet because there were so many of them. In other words, if you've got my horses in my backyard, if I don't have any grass on the ground, they're going to start nibbling at the myrtle bushes or the azaleas or even the pine trees for something to eat. So the Park Service decided that they needed to reduce the size of the herd on Shackleford Banks. They came up with a proposal that they would reduce the herd, which at that point was over about 200 horses, bring it down to a representative herd of 50 to 60 individuals. Well, locals decided that couldn't happen, that it didn't sound right to them, first of all, that the horses should be impacted in this way, But secondly, that a herd of that size would not be genetically viable. That bringing the numbers down that low would result in inbreeding, which again would affect the long-term survivability of the herd. And the other thing that didn't sit right with them, knowing again the history of all livestock that had been on Shackleford Banks, they couldn't see that the horses were having that kind of an impact on the vegetation on that island, except for the fact that there were at that point too many. So this group of local folks talked amongst themselves, became involved. There was an actual rally at the courthouse to sort of make people aware of what was going to happen or what the Park Service was proposing. Efforts, and I'm short-circuiting a lot of this, but efforts were made to try to prevail on local officials and the Park Service to intervene and to stop this plan, that it was not a good idea. And those, shall we say, efforts were rebuffed. Would that be accurate, Ms. Mason? The culture, again, I can say this because I was their lawyer for a period of time. The culture in the Park Service back then was, if you were a superintendent of park, you were pretty much, you ran the parks. You know, you think about it, the national parks in a lot of places are very isolated. They're in, rural areas. They're a long, long way from Washington, D.C. Nobody's looking over your shoulder for the most part. And as long as you semi-placate local people, you can do pretty much whatever you want to do. And that was their attitude, that whether they were invested in this plan or not, once folks expressed resistance and dissatisfaction with it, they dug in. Big mistake. Because this group became organized. And again, that gets back to my original point about civics and what you have to do to make yourselves credible and to have an influence. And they organized, and they incorporated, and they prevailed upon our late congressman in this district, Congressman Walter B. Jones. Sorry, I can't say his name without getting choked up. Congressman Jones to get involved. And I'm going to ask Carolyn to tell the story about having the opportunity to meet with him first and get him involved. So,
the first time I ever met Walter, I'm a retired librarian. I ran libraries for the Marine Corps at Cherry Point and Camp Lejeune. And a friend of mine, Jerry Hyatt, we were all getting concerned about the articles that we were seeing in the paper about removal of these horses. And a friend of mine, Jerry Hyatt from Newport, called me one day, and he knew I had started working on the history, the written history of the horses. And he said, Carolyn, I've talked to the mayor of Newport. Walter Jones is going to be at the Holiday Inn in Havelock, and he's got 20 minutes or so to talk to the congressman, and he's given me 5. I want you to go because you're working on the history. I said, well, okay. I'd never met a congressman before in my life or any kind of, high-up representative. So I went, and I had gotten from the Spanish Mustang Registry a video, remember those old video cassettes, of where their horses came from. And it said they came from the native tribes here, there, and from private collections here, there, and from the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And in that video, you see a flaxen-maned horse coming flying over a sand dune. So I gave him that, and what little history I had gotten written by then. And I'll never forget, he said, Carolyn, I heard about those horses in the 4th grade. 4th grade is when they start teaching North Carolina history. And I'm going to look into this, and the rest was history. He took it right on through. And when the vote came in Congress, the vote was, I think, 416-6. And we figured those 6 were aggravated at Walter for something. And there were 2. One was the congresswoman from Montana, and one of the Kennedys put for the record, the congressional record, that had they been present, they would have voted yes. And like I said, it hurts my heart that Walter is not with us anymore. He listened to the people, which I remember going to the Park Service one day, and the superintendent at the time made the comment, he didn't work for the local people, he worked for the people of the United States. And I thought, the last time I looked, I was a citizen. And the last time I looked, North Carolina and Shackleford Banks were part of the United States. But we had some tough goings on there. She was talking about the beginning. I sometimes get credit, which I hate, for starting this foundation. I did not. There were several of us that got together because we were reading all these things in the paper, and I got into it at the beginning. I was working at Cherry Point. One of my library techs said, "Are you going to the meeting about the horses?" I said, "What meeting?" She said, "It's in Beaufort today." And I went and I listened, and I called my boss and said, "I need 4 hours annual leave." And then I went and listened to some of the proposals, and I was horrified at some of those proposals that involved moving horses, killing a lot of horses. And so I came back and I thought something's wrong. And Jerry Hyatt again had started a petition at Crossroads, Harkers Island. And so I went down, saw it, I signed it, and I went to a friend of mine who was a horse person, Anita Kimball. She's a realtor, licensed realtor, but she had raised registered paints for years, the spotted horses. And I talked to her about it, and then we were talking at this time about maybe we need to get organized. And a woman named Margaret Willis, who raised Arabians from sea level, got in on it. Florence Kaufman, who boarded her horse there. And you're talking about here a realtor, a librarian, a chemist, and I forgot a nurse, a ER nurse was Florence. And Wilson Davis. But Anita said, "We'll call Wilson. He'd be a good president," because a lot of people knew him in the community. So she called him. He was in West Virginia in the hospital. He had a farm and some horses up there. And we talked him in his hospital bed into being the president of the Foundation for Shackleford Horses. And I'm trying to think.
I have to tell them at this point, so that is how they became referred to by the former superintendent of the park as Wilson Davis and those 4 crazy women.
Right, yeah.
That's how he referred to the foundation
Right.
in the early days.
Rose Griffin was one of the first ones. She's their public relations person, but she was a supervisor at Cherry Point, and originally still lives on Harkers Island. So this ragtag bunch of different professions got together and started this organization. And as she said, I have letters once it became known, and Walter got in on it. We got letters from Betty Ray McCain, who was the Secretary of State for North Carolina, asking everybody to please support these wonderful characters on our coast.
Betty Ray McCain, a Democrat, wrote a letter in support of legislation introduced by Walter Jones,
Right.
a Republican. I mean, again, I'm going to show you these threads all the way through how people came together, not based on party or ideology or politics, but because the cause was just.
Right.
That's what mattered.
And I came home from Cherry Point one day, and I had an answering machine by my computer, and I punched it, and this voice said, "Hello, this is Jesse Helms." I about fainted, But he was talking about he was going to do, what he could in the Senate, get these horses protected and all that. And things like that were happening all over the place. But Beverly Perdue sent us a note one time and said, "We're working for those horses. They're my horses too." For North Carolina. And the Outer Banks horses, we talked about it, Corolla got it done, are the North Carolina state horse now, which is something else to their credit. I also got to do So I said I was a librarian. So one of the reasons that people saw me more was because the rest of them didn't want to speak in public. And they pushed me out there, so I was the face and the voice they heard. And I was working on this paper, working in the library. I would take history books, North Carolina history books home with me at night. I interlibrary loaned them from all over the place, everything I could find on the internet. I'd interlibrary loan or buy the book, and came up with this paper that Walter put in the local legacies collection at the Library of Congress, and which was kind of nice. I finished it about 2 o'clock in the morning. I had been up all day and I think the night before. And I told my husband, you got to drive me to Greenville, let's do today. So I slept with my head in his lap all the way to Greenville. And I walked in and put that paper and notebook with pictures down and got back in the car and slept in his lap all the way home. We cut it close sometimes.
So kind of we're going to jump around with the story a little bit, but getting back to, you know, what was happening on the ground, the Park Service was pushing back against this resistance and taking the position that the size of the herd needed to be reduced. Yeah.
One thing we did, one of the first things we did, because was contact the top equine geneticists in their fields, either in the country or and sometimes in the world. Dan Rubenstein, I remember the first, and we would get on the bar stools in my kitchen and make these calls. And I remember calling Princeton. Now, Dan Rubenstein was the director of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton University. He'd been on Shackleford studying those horses for over 20 years. He's a behaviorist. He also studies zebras in Africa. Anyway, I dialed the number expecting the secretary to answer, and this voice said, "Hi, this is Dan Rubenstein." Again, I about fell out of my chair. We talked to Gus Cothran, University of Kentucky, who's genetics expert, Phil Spangenberg at Virginia Tech Veterinary School at Blacksburg, who's a equine color expert. He and Gus worked together in IDing Spanish colonial horses. We talked to the head of museums in Florida about some of the fossils down there and horse records. There's a site on the internet, I believe it's called Beringia. But going back to the point, you know, horses evolved on this continent. They were three-toed little guys named Eohippus. And they gradually developed into the present-day horse migrating. They went across the land bridge between the U.S. and Alaska when it was there, and the Bering Sea. And they have found freeze-dried fossils in Alaska. And one of the pictures of one of the ones that was hiding everything looked just like one we had on Shackleford named Dusty. But anyway, and the thing about they've always been here, you've got to realize who the people are here now. They were English, Scots, Welsh, Irish. The Spanish got here first. They don't tell you that very much in the history books, but the Spanish were going all up and down the coast way before the first Englishmen set foot in Roanoke or Cedar Island, whichever. And what they would do, they would drop off animals, cows, sheep, goats, horses, if they thought they were coming back, because they would multiply and there'd be more for meat or whatever. So that was one of the and also there are records of ships that were coming up here with horses. Greenville came up, I believe it was Greenville, wasn't it, Connie? It came up from Hispaniola, which is Cuba area, Haiti and Dominican Republic, with a load of horses and cattle, and they had to careen the boat. She ran aground, and careening means they turned it over on its side to repair the bottom, and whatever they had on board got jumped off. So there are all kinds of ways they could have gotten here. Nobody knows for sure. But Gus Cothran was one, University of Kentucky geneticist, that said when they brought up the 50 to 60 horses, Gus said, "That's not enough. They won't survive." And we sent his letter or his email straight to Walter. And some of the other people, I mean, they were all, we would call these offices of these guys that were known worldwide for their expertise, and they'd answer the phone. And every time I'd say, my credentials were high. I'm Carolyn Mason. I live in Betty near the Shackleford Horses. And every one of them said, oh, yes, how can I help you?
Their ability to reach out to these people, to pursue the experts and collect that information, those facts, that data. This wasn't just a group of folks who had a passion about something, who cared about something, who said, like, I probably would have, but those are my Tarzan's ancestors, or whatever. They compiled the information that Walter Jones needed to use to persuade his colleagues in Congress to join with him on this legislation, because it's important to know this legislation here, the Shackleford Banks Wild Horses Protection Act, is unique. And again, as somebody who litigated for them for years, for a congressman to come in and tell the National Park Service, you need to do something within a particular park in a particular way, they don't like that. And so this was going to be a change in the park. They were going to be charged with the responsibility for maintaining that herd, just like they had the responsibility for maintaining the lighthouse, maintaining the turtles, maintaining the birds, all of that. The horses were now going to be on their to-do list. So this was a big deal, and there was going to be pushback from the administration. Walter understood that. And so the fact that these folks did the legwork and found the experts who could say what they're proposing to do is potentially detrimental was very important to help persuade people and to bring so many people, again, across the aisle. This is 1998. We had a Democrat in the White House, if you recall. We had a Congress that was of the opposite party, but as Carolyn mentioned, folks all across North Carolina, officials, joined in support of this congressman's legislation. Governor Hunt, Betty Ray McCain, Beverly Perdue, who was the lieutenant governor, all came out in support of this. And then, as it turned out, we had someone in the White House who was another, ace in a hole, Erskine Bowles. How many of you are familiar with that name? He was President Clinton's chief of staff at that time, but a North Carolinian from Charlotte. He had been the president of the university. He was, and like Walter Jones said, I remember learning about these horses in the 4th grade. So he, when it finally went to the president's desk with overwhelming vote in favor of it, there was no question, that it was going to be enacted. And so it set in motion this, it stipulated certain things, that the herd would be maintained in certain numbers that had been recommended by the experts, and that is a target range of 120 to 130 horses. And charged the Park Service with maintaining that herd. Always keeping in mind the balance with the natural resources of the park, of course. But the target range for the horses would be 110 to 120, 120 to 130, which is what Gus Cothran, the geneticist, recommended, would allow us to have a viable herd. That the herd would be co-managed by the Park Service together with the Foundation for Shackleford Horses. Never happened in the history of the Park Service that an outside third party is allowed to come in and co-manage a resource with the park. But that's what this legislation set up. And that relationship has been in place, again, 25 years. And so here we are, 25 years later, and and yeah, and wearing out quickly. I came on board shortly after the legislation passed, and it was the time that the agreements that would implement this new relationship were being drafted, and I offered to help, having left the Department of Interior, but still knowing how to talk their talk, could help in crafting those agreements, like our memorandum of understanding, our management plan, all that kind of thing. And that's how I got on board and got involved first. But we have, you can imagine, it was a forced marriage in the beginning. You know, the legislation dictated that the two of us would come together and work this out, and we have. It was difficult in the beginning because, again, the attitude of the Park Service was one of resentment for not only what the locals had done, but also that this legislation was imposed on them.
I'll give an example. I was over there one day, and we had contacted all these experts, and well, we were at a meeting with the park and made a statement, and the superintendent crossed his arms like this and said, "Who told you that, your grandma?" And I said, "No, Dan Rubenstein, chairman of the Department of Ecology and Ecology at Princeton University." So that's why we did it.
Yeah, they were very skeptical in the beginning, and they candidly underestimated this group of local folks, and what they could do, what they knew, and so it took a while to build trust, to build a relationship, to come to terms, make decisions. And in those early years, the other sort of overlaying concern, if you will, was that of EIA, and that was the other impetus for the creation of the foundation, if you will, and what the foundation wanted to do. EIA is the short name for equine infectious anemia. It is an incurable disease in horses. It's transmitted by flies. And it basically, if a fly bites an infected horse and then flies away to another horse and bites that horse, before the blood has a chance to dry on the fly's mouth, then that subsequent horse may become infected. The experts say that it takes about 200 yards for that blood to dry, and so for those fly not to be able to transmit. And so your only option with an infected horse is to keep them quarantined 200 yards away from any other horse, or to euthanize it. State law in every state in the country requires that horses be tested for EIA if they are transported, sold, taken to an auction, taken to a show, anything like that. And so when the Park Service was originally proposing to take horses off of Shackleford Banks, the state of North Carolina said, "Fine, go with God, but just know they've all got to be EIA tested before they come off Shackleford Banks." Well, that started this long and tragic several years of roundups, of testing and removals. And in the early years, quite a few horses tested positive for EIA. And so the solution was, we will euthanize those horses. And the foundation, the other thing that they wanted to see happen, in addition to preserving the herd on Shackleford in genetically viable numbers, was to give some sort of refuge to these EIA positive horses. After all, they had lived for who knows how long in the wild with this disease, quote unquote, with no physical manifestation. These horses were what we call inapparent carriers. There's no evidence that they were sick. They were not sick. But they did test positive for the disease. And again, they consulted the leading expert, Chuck Issel at the University of Kentucky, about EIA, and he said, yes, there is such a thing as an inapparent carrier. And yes, they can live for years without showing any signs of the disease. And that, and particularly in a wild population, because we haven't studied it in depth, it may be that wild horses have a different body chemistry or a different way that the virus affects them, that they are able to fend off the progression of the disease. We just don't know. But no, they're not hurting anybody out there on an island, you know? So the foundation proposed to the park, let us get property. Let us get a site that is isolated, that is remote, that would be a quote-unquote quarantine site where these horses can come and live out their lives in much the same environment as they have over at Shackleford Banks. Please don't kill them. And that request was denied. And those horses were killed. And I don't want to get into all the details of that history, but it was a very difficult and fraught time. So the next calendar year, when this roundup came up again and horses were tested again, at that point there were, I was going to say 7. Was it 8? That's right. And so by that time, the park had succeeded. I mean, I keep saying the park. The foundation had succeeded in getting a quarantine site approved by the state. And they had a place to take those horses. And so they took those 8 and kept them there. It was property that was donated by a very generous benefactor in Williston. He allowed the foundation to rent that property for $1 a year. And that quarantine site exists to this day. I want you to think about that for a minute. 1997, we still have a site, and we still have one horse in quarantine. He is 36 years old.
36, 38. I have to
Yeah.
go back and look it up.
38 years old. And but that's what we have left of the horses. We added 2 more after that initial group. We added 2 more, but now we're down to 1. And so that was their other goal, was to try to find a place of refuge for these EIA positive horses. The state required, once any positive was found, that the herd test EIA free for 3 consecutive years before they would release the Shackleford horses from the requirement. Yeah, before they would release the Shackleford horses from the requirement, but we had to go clean for 3. So we had the first 2, and then the 3rd year we were good, and then yeah. So we did roundups for a number of years. Even after the legislation passed, we did roundups to test the herd for EIA, and they finally went 3 years in a row with no EIA positive horses, and we haven't had to do annual roundups since. But that was, again, that was sort of the 2-prong goals of the foundation in its creation. Find a way to preserve and protect the Shackleford herd on Shackleford Banks, and to give the horses that were taken off refuge. The legislation also stipulates that any horses removed from Shackleford become the property of the foundation. That was kind of the 3rd prong of the legislation. And so, in addition to taking those EIA positive horses, other horses that were removed in order to reduce the size of the herd in those early years, because again, remember what I said at the beginning when this all first started, we were talking about over 200 horses on the island. Now they removed and eliminated a lot, but still needed a mechanism, if you will, to bring that number down quickly, because we were going to start birth controlling some of those mares to do population control. But we needed to bring, before that birth control started to work, we needed a way to get the herd numbers down. And those horses came to the foundation. We made an effort to try to take off younger ones because they would more easily adapt to being, taken out of that kind of an environment and rehomed. The older ones that we removed, we had private individuals at Cedar Island who were willing to take them to help reestablish the herd at Cedar Island that had been decimated over the years for various reasons. And so that was a wonderful option to be able to take horses out of the wild from Shackleford, take them to Cedar Island, turn them loose again, and let them live in essentially was the same kind of environment there. So since that time, we have not done any wholesale removals, but we have had a couple of situations where we had younger horses that couldn't necessarily survive on their own, abandoned by mother, or mother was not able to care for them, and we have intervened and removed those newborns. And I'll let Carolyn tell the story of one that got a door-to-door Uber to NC State, if she wants to tell about that.
His name was Diego. The Park Service called one day and said, we have a foal about 2 days old. We'll be at your house in 40 minutes. So Anita and I were running around trying to find mare's mats or something to give this baby. And foals, I've raised 2 of them from 2 days old. And they have to be fed every 4 hours round the clock. So for about a month and a half. And I have been asleep in the barn with the horse because, every 4 hours. And with Diego, we put shavings down. I had an old quilt, big blue quilt that I put on top. And would go out there and give him his bottles. And after a while, when he finally finished the bottle, I'd fall asleep too and wake up just in time to go fix another bottle. But Diego had an eye scratch, but he fell before they brought him off into a water hole and had sand all over his face. Well, he scratched his eye with sand. So we noticed this place coming up, and we knew that an infection in the eye can blind the horses. So at the time, I had a Lincoln town car about the size of an aircraft carrier. And we put the big blue quilt in the back, and my grandchildren were toddlers, so I had Pampers at my house. So I packed a diaper bag with some bottles and the Pampers and got the quilt going. And Rose Griffin was going to be driving. I'm in the back with the horse. And we packed him up and took him up to NC State. And when we got there, we had called ahead, but when we came up, lady came out. If you've ever been there, this great big porte cocheres up there for trailers to pull under. We pulled up in the car, and the lady came out and said, may I help you? I said, yes, we're here for Diego. She said, where's your trailer? And I did like that. He was asleep in the back seat. She said, oh, my Lord, and went back in. So we pulled on up to the doors, and when I went in to get him registered, they were already getting him out. I mean, they're tiny. If you've ever seen a foal over there, they're tiny. They're like a Labrador retriever with longer legs. And but anyway, he went in, and once the word spread, that little horse had about 15 female ophthalmology students, vet students, around him, observing everything that was going on. And when we got ready to go, I again signed the papers and did whatever. And I turned around to get him, and we had a harness on him, like a dog harness that has the hook in the back that goes under here and under here, because he was too small for even a mini halter. They'd fall off him. So I had the harness on him, and if we were walking along, if I wanted to go somewhere, I picked him up and turned him, and we went. But we were when I turned around to get him, one of the surgeons had come out. A lady surgeon had her mask down, all her blue clothes on. She had him in her arms. And we opened the door, and she looked inside and said, air conditioning, I just can't stand it, and put him down. So then on the way back, he kind of woke up, and I got on the seat like this with him behind me so that if Rosie had to stop quickly, he wouldn't fall on the floor. And we're going down that 2-lane highway between New Bern and Kinston, and he's standing up looking out the window. It was up, but he's looking out the window. And a truck would go by, and then it would come back. And a car would go by, and then it would go back. And I told Rosie, I said, can't you hear it in there? She's saying, honey, I just saw a horse in that car. He said, no, it's a dog. Let's go. and they back up to see. But Diego looked out the window almost all the way to Cherry Point, and then he started messing with me because he was hungry. So I got we had Gatorade packed. He'd had all his milk, so I put some Gatorade in the bottle, and before I could get the lid on, he nudged my arm, and it went in my hair. I thought Rosie was going to wreck the car because she saw it in the rearview mirror. So I finally got in and got a bottle in his mouth, and we made it home. But that was one of our the trip with the 4-lane highway with him looking out the window was kind of unforgettable.
What Carolyn mentioned about getting the call from the park that we're bringing you a baby, that's demonstrates sort of an evolution of the relationship over time. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give credit in here to somebody who was very special in forging sort of a new path for that relationship after it had gotten off to a contentious start, and that's Superintendent Bob Bogle, who some of you may know and remember from his tenure here. But Bob was one of those extraordinary individuals who sort of understood that you can't run a park in a community and not be a part of that community and not respect that community and its residents. And so he worked very closely with us to repair the relationship and to rebuild the trust. And then the other person that I have to give credit to is Dr. Sue Stuska, who has been the horse specialist from the get-go. When the legislation passed, as I mentioned, I had been with Interior, and I was living here at that time, and I spoke to the person who was the regional director back then, is a man named in Atlanta named Jerry Belson, and Jerry was saying, "Okay, Margaret, what needs to happen now?" And I said, "Well, it's going to take a while, Jerry. You know that people still are very skeptical here, even with this legislation. They don't trust the park's motives." And I said, "Not to mention, the park doesn't have horses, you know, as its priority on its radar, whatever." And Jerry Belson, to his credit, said, "Well, then we need a horse person in that park." And he is the person who's responsible for the creation of that position that Dr. Stuska took as the initial person and has been there ever since as the horse biologist, if you will. And she came in, and horses are her passion, and these horses are most assuredly her passion. And she's been instrumental in not only building the relationship with the foundation, but making sure that the decisions that we make are the right ones, that they're consistent with our charge and our mission in the legislation, but that they're also they're ethical, they're fair, they're respectful of the horse's wildness. So, for example, we don't jump in every time a horse gets a cut or a colic or some other injury. But if there's a foal and it's been abandoned by its mother, it's bogged down in the watering hole and the herd has left it behind, and it's not going to survive, obviously, without its mother, then if they have the opportunity to intervene and then turn it over to us, and we can do the humane thing and save that foal and then find it a new home, which Diego has, then that's what needs to happen. We actually had plans to launch Pony Patrol pre-COVID. It was an idea that we formulated together with the Rachel Carson Reserve and Paula Gilligan, and we're going to do it as a joint project. And then COVID intervened and prevented us from getting it off the ground way back when. So this year, when we revisited it, we had a volunteer in park, an existing volunteer in park, a guy named Rich Rim, who stepped up and said, "I will agree to be the volunteer coordinator for this new Pony Patrol pilot, so to speak. I'll schedule them. I'll put together the training for them. I'll take it and run. And let's see how it goes and use it as an opportunity to learn and see what we can do better going forward. And then hopefully maybe next year we can join with Rachel Carson and launch it there as well, because the Beaufort horses, as I like to call them, get a lot of visitors and a lot of people trying to do stupid things too. So there's no shortage of that around. So, but it's a great program, and yes, and the emphasis in the training is answering people's questions, telling them, helping educate them about the horses, but also intervening when somebody is trying to harass the horses. Federal law requires that people stay away from the horses. Harassing, attempting to feed, touching, petting, anything like that is a federal offense and will get you a federal citation from law enforcement if you're caught. And you don't have to be caught in the act. We have pursued folks who have been videoed doing things like that. And so the Pony Patrol is out there to try to hopefully discourage folks from doing that kind of thing, or intervene if possible, or call upon law enforcement to come and intervene depending on the severity of the situation. Yeah.
One thing that worries me is I think people are losing the concept of what wild is. And the best example I can give you is I got an email from a lady in Ohio, and she wrote, "We are coming down to see the Shackleford Banks wild horses." The next sentence said, "Who do we see about riding them?"
Yeah. So it takes all kinds, right?
What did you say?
I emailed back and said, "Ma'am, the operative word is wild. You can't ride them." She wrote wild.
So that's I guess kind of the important message where I want to end, and that is that out of all these efforts, because I don't have any idea what time it is, but it's getting close to 3 o'clock, I think. Out of all these efforts, grew this relationship, which is wonderful now. We're very grateful for the current superintendent, Jeff West. We think he's cut out of the same cloth as Bob to some extent. And he's a cowboy, we have to note. Raised in Texas, cowboy. So we're grateful for him and all the folks there. And we work really hard now to manage the challenges that we're facing and that the horses are facing, and no longer have to worry about managing our relationship, so to speak. And those horses have lots of challenges. It is not smooth sailing. And if there is a takeaway that I would like to give you all, besides, be a good citizen, the takeaway is that it's going to take all of us, and it still may not be enough. Because they are threatened, and more people visit Shackleford every year, and those horses are incredibly adaptive, but there's also a lot of pressure brought to bear on them, and just think about it, the daily agenda for a horse, if you will. It's eat, drink, sleep, eat, drink, sleep, maybe reproduce in certain seasons, and that's it. And so if it's eat, oh God, here comes some people, have to move, stop eating. Time to go to the watering hole. Oh, can't go there, people have the beach blocked. Foal needs to rest. Nope, sorry, mama's hurrying it along because here come people. Stallion trying to keep his mares together and reproduce. Oh, can't do that. Here come the people. In the meantime, bachelor stallion comes and takes his mares away. Landscape is changing because of changing climate, because of introduction of non-native species like birds dropping Bermuda grass. Centipede grass. Centipede grass is taking over Shackleford Banks. Where's it coming from? Our yards.
There are now 2 ferries that come to Shackleford Banks.
yeah.
One at the east end and one at the west end.
Mhm.
So there's really no place for the horses to go.
Right.
To get us into a scout.
As Shackleford is migrating, too. You have to understand, I mean, Shackleford's a dynamic island environment, barrier island, and it's constantly moving. And so the horses environment is changing and moving with that. And then if you have compounding that pressure, visitors who are pushing those horses out of their territory. The horses used to have ranges. We know this. Carolyn mentioned Dan Rubenstein, who's been studying these horses for 40 years over there. The horses used to have ranges. They used to stay in territories. They don't do that anymore. They don't stay in territories. And how much of that is, influenced by us and our activities over there and our constant pressure on that environment. Locals have always gone to Shackleford. There was a picture of my mama and her girlfriends sitting on the beach at Shackleford back in the 50s. That was just on Facebook last week. A whole bunch. I mean, and they claim, I don't know, take it for what it's worth. They claim that they used to walk and swim to get to Shackleford.
But here on the news, people were stuck on Shark
Yes, on
Island.
Shark Island. Yes. But anyway, I'm saying locals have always gone to Shackleford. Visitation is not new, but not this kind of volume, this incessant.
We used to stay on the beach,
Well,
on the south side.
so anyway, I didn't mean to. I kind of, but we all have to join in the efforts to educate people, to explain to them that it's not only about you might get kicked or you might get bitten. If that horse stops what it's doing as a part of its natural daily activities, then you've put stress on that horse. And the accumulation of that stress over time is going to diminish the herd's survivability. That's where we are. So people need to be mindful of their activities and treat wild as wild.
I was going to say in that the reason we got Diego is someone was over there. There's a law that you have to keep it. You can take a dog, but it has to be kept on a 6-foot leash. Someone was over there with a dog off a leash. The dog ran towards the herd. The stallion gathered his mares. The baby fell in the water hole. The mare tried to come back. This is what we found out from people that saw what was going on. To get the foal, and the stallion wouldn't let her. Better lose a foal than one of his mares. I mean, that was the natural instinct of him to do. But then the people called the park, and I think somewhere there's a picture of some lady holding this muddy little foal, waiting for the Park Service to come. But it was a dog off a leash chasing a herd, and the stallion took his mares away, and they lost the baby.